Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard. Last week I compared the complete game of the arcade and Genesis versions of Mortal Kombat, and I figured it'd only be fair to compare the Super Nintendo version to those versions this week. The format here will be a little different than normal, so I can keep the video shorter and not cover too much of the same ground. I'll show some of the arcade game first and then follow that with the Super Nintendo and Genesis games with commentary right after, rinse and repeat. Let's dive right on in, shall we? Alright, here we fight Scorpion in the first area in the arcade game. This version has much larger characters and typically the most layers of scrolling, more background details, and has the highest resolution. I'll note before we see the console versions that the SNES has separate animation for Sub-Zero and Scorpion, while the Genesis version does not.
Sub-Zero with fatality.
The Genesis version is severely color reduced, while the SNES version is a bit less so. The Genesis version is missing some scrolling layers and backgrounds like the mountains. On the Super Nintendo, we've got some of those elements, but there are fewer rows of monks. On Super Nintendo, we see all of Shang Tsung in his chair, unlike on Genesis, where we only see about half of him. Okay, and now the fatality. The Genesis version matches the arcade one, while on the Super Nintendo we get a new, censored, bloodless fatality. And in fact, the fatalities have been renamed to finishing moves on SNES. Here's a look at the arcade version of the second stage. It's got a lot of layers, including mountains and scrolling clouds here. And also note the gate that reaches into the foreground, the various flames, banners, and the detail on the pagoda.
Sub-Zero wins fatality.
For this stage, the SNES has more background elements and layers than Genesis, like the clouds. There are also mountains way off to the left on the Super Nintendo as well. The pagoda in the background is tiny on Super Nintendo, and that version is also missing the dragon banners. While the background is emptier on Genesis, everything looks more pixely and chunky on the SNES due to its lower resolution. And look how high up on the screen the characters are on Super Nintendo. Sculptured software weirdly made the levels taller on SNES, with the bottom portions extended and pushed the characters up towards the middle of the screen. The music on the SNES version more closely matches the arcade one, despite being very quiet and honestly not sounding all that great. The samples they chose are a bit muffled and low quality. Okay, back to the arcade version. Notice all the scrolling layers here, and in particular, let's take a look at those statues. To the right of Goro, we've got Liu Kang in the arcade version. Make a note of that. As far as the layers, we've got layers for the foreground, the bushes, the mountains, and the moon. On the Genesis, we lose the mountains and the moon. The statue of Liu Kang to the right of Goro is replaced with one of the ninjas. Also, the background color is way brighter for some reason. On SNES, we're missing the mountain layer, but we have the moon and we have the statue of Liu Kang. We also get more of the gate in the foreground. Oddly enough, the background color is much darker in this version than the arcade one. Because the backgrounds are so much taller on SNES, we basically get a bunch of negative space at the bottom of the screen that's not present in the arcade original or the Genesis port. Here's the one and only bonus stage I'll show you during the comparison. Here's a look at the arcade version first. We'll see the Genesis version's presentation is more arcade-like in the way that the UI elements slide in from the side of the screen, while on the Super Nintendo they just appear. Here's the arcade version of the pit. Notice that we'll see a scrolling layer with mountains that isn't present in either of the home versions at the bottom left area of the arena. Also, for Johnny Cage's Shadow Kick, we get multiple shadows in the arcade one, way more than either of the 16-bit home console versions. As we knock our opponent into the pit, look how populated the pit itself is, and note all the shaking and the satisfying crunch when your opponent lands. Yep, on both Genesis and SNES, they took out the mountain layer just like I said. The clouds also look different in both versions, but are closer to the arcade on Genesis. The background color on SNES is much closer to the arcade release. I'll throw in here that the control is awful on SNES, with an insane amount of input delay. The control and gameplay is way better on the Genesis. Now, as we get down to the pit itself, it's awful empty in both versions. I get it on SNES, but why Genesis? Here we are on the arcade version's throne room with Kano. We'll see in this arcade original that Shang Tsung's head follows the fighters as they move from side to side. The background also has silver window frames and 4 columns on their own scrolling layer. In this version, we also see mountains outside behind the windows. Both home versions lose the layer of mountains you can see behind the windows in the arcade original.
Fatality.
The Genesis version is missing the columns entirely. Shang Tsung's head doesn't turn when you move across the screen, the window frames are gold instead of silver, and the dragons are gold, and the marble floor has been severely color reduced. On SNES we get the columns, but they share a scrolling layer with other background elements. The window frames and dragons are closer in color to the arcade original, and the marble floor looks much better. Oddly enough, the proportions of the background on the Super Nintendo are mostly correct in this arena, which makes me wonder why they aren't on the others.
Sub-Zero wins.
Next up, we've got Raiden and Goro's lair in the arcade original. Note the skeletons and bones strewn across the floor and the relatively good-looking cracked stone texture on that floor, with Street Fighter II style line scrolling in the arcade version. It actually uses a combination of line scrolling and multiple layers on the floor to help give it a smoother look. I'll also point out that Raiden says one of 2 different gibberish phrases when he dives forward at you in this version. One of them sounds an awful lot like "Choppin' broccoli!"
Sub-Zero wins. Fatality.
The Genesis version of this background looks absolutely terrible with little detail on the floor and weird colors on the back wall. There are no bones on the floor in the foreground, and the line-scrolling floor is replaced with a super simple and dull pattern across a few layers. The boring Game Over music plays in this area as well. On the SNES, things look a bit better with some bones in the foreground and a more complex floor design, even though it still uses layers instead of any line scrolling. Also, the skeleton is much more human-sized on Super Nintendo. This version also plays the wrong music here, but different wrong music than on Genesis. Now, we'll go ahead and skip to Goro, since we've seen all the other fighters from the mirror match and endurance rounds already.
Sub-Zero.
So in the arcade, Goro gets to make a good entrance with a big growl and stretching animation. And only the arcade version has that particular stretching animation. Goro's also a little bit bigger than the other characters you'll notice, but not really by a ton.
Sub-Zero wins.
On Genesis, this fight basically looks okay, aside from the background complaints I made a few moments ago. Goro is sort of an appropriate size here for Genesis compared to the other characters. His animation is generally okay. But hey, Round 1 is missing the character shadows on Genesis for some reason. But don't worry, they come back for Round 2 and, if necessary, Round 3. I feel like for this fight, the Super Nintendo really drops the ball, with having Goro way too low on the floor, much lower than your fighter, and it just looks super weird and dumb. The Genesis version plays the wrong song here, while the SNES version plays the right one, but it sounds terrible.
Sub-Zero wins.
we're back to the arcade version and we're going to fight Shang Tsung, the game's final boss. Where do we fight him? We have yet another fight in Goro's lair. Blah. Shang Tsung can throw multiple flaming skulls in quick succession, all on screen at once in the arcade version. In the home version, he can only throw one flaming skull at a time. Anyway, the main thing to pay attention to here is what happens when you defeat Shang Tsung. When that happens, the screen flashes, all the characters pop out of them, and the game announces everyone's name. It's sufficiently impactful for the defeat of the game's final. Is pretty close in both versions. Visually, it's mainly just color differences that separate the SNES and Genesis versions. Neither console version plays the right song during this fight. So remember how I mentioned that big splashy ending in the arcade version? Well, that's the biggest difference in this stage between the Genesis and Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo version is considerably closer to the arcade version, with a much more elaborate sequence when you beat Shang Tsung, versus just some plain, abrupt, and simple text that pops up on Genesis. Probe was so lazy with this. I mean, on the Genesis you don't even get an endgame jingle. Come on! I'll show a character-specific ending, but not the credits, since it's just names over the pit background. Sorry, I have to keep the music super low here, otherwise I'll get a copyright claim, which is what happened to me last week. In the arcade and Genesis games, we get to see all of the actors' credits with each character flipping into view, which is cut out of the SNES version. For the arcade and Genesis, we get some nice stills and story text during the ending, before the credits pop on. So here's the Genesis, in which we can see a very similar ending to the arcade release, although it is scaled back for the hardware, and we don't have the proper ending music. But the Genesis version does include the entire arcade ending, which is a lot more than we can say for the Super Nintendo. On SNES, your character just drops down on a normal background and it shows text on the screen. At least it does play the right song. Notice some of the text is censored on Super Nintendo, like the word assassination is replaced with the word destruction. Alright, so conclusions. The graphics overall are better on the Super Nintendo version, even though there are a few areas where the Genesis version is a bit closer to the arcade. The interface on SNES looks much more like the arcade original. The weird background proportions do kinda hurt the overall look of the Super Nintendo version though. Now sound is kind of a tough one to decide. The SNES music is much more similar to the arcade music, and it has more songs and more effects. You'd think this would be an easy win for the Super Nintendo. The problem is the music is super low volume and uses muffled, grating samples. I think I have to call this category a draw. The Genesis music sounds better, but the SNES voices and effects sound better. When it comes to the all-important category of gameplay, the Genesis absolutely trounces the Super Nintendo version. The control delay on the SNES is god-awful, and I can't believe the game was released in this state. It's got close to a second of input delay, which is completely unacceptable. The Genesis version controls fast and smooth and feels very much like the arcade version. Overall then, which 16-bit console version of Mortal Kombat is the best? Hands down the Genesis version. It doesn't look quite as good as the SNES game. The music is a little different and there's a little less of it, but the control and gameplay are just dramatically better on Genesis. I mean, it's not even remotely close. And of course you also get the uncensored version of the game on Genesis. Now things were a little different with the home versions of Mortal Kombat 2, but that's a story and a video for another time. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please toss it a like, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe. Also, please help spread the word about my little channel. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me what you think of this format. Do you want to see more condensed comparisons like this one? With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.